Hello everyone, and welcome to Classic Gaming Today, where we take a look at the gaming experiences of the past through the eyes of the present. I am your host, Tony, and today we're going to look at Super Punch-Out!, an arcade-style boxing title, developed and published by Nintendo for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System back in 1994. We're going to talk about that game in just a couple minutes, but first, as is usual, just a little bit of housekeeping up front. As always, I'm excited to be here. I hope all of you are as well. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general. I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. We do weekly and monthly gaming challenges, prizes, rewards, discussions. It's all out there. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/classicgamingtoday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon-exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/classicgamingtoday is where it's at. I'd also like to give a shout out to our Pantheon patrons. They are ISO, Rich Senewal, David Morton, Sam Twardowski, Sean Oliver, and Maximus Marshall, Steve Novoselic, Wendell Jr., Chris Snowden, The Bay 101, Toucan Sam, Christopher Fos, Grayor, Snatch Bandicoot, NYC, Lewis W., Martin Steiner, James Nunn, Yuzu Soda, Vince Gameplays, Hammond Egger, and Marek. Thanks to our patrons for supporting the show, and thank you all for supporting the show. Whether you contribute monetarily or simply listen on a regular basis, I truly do appreciate all of the support. Before we start diving deep into Super Punch-Out!, I thought it would be a good idea to let everybody know why I chose Super Punch-Out! For today's episode. And the simple fact is, it's because I had never played the game. Yes, that's right. Super Punch-Out!, one of the most iconic games for the Super NES, one of the most revered titles in the Punch-Out! Series, I had never played it. Now, I have played other Punch-Out! Titles. I have fond memories of playing Mike Tyson's Punch-Out! When I was younger. We played Mike Tyson's Punch-Out! For a prior episode of this podcast. And even more recently, I was able to visit an arcade and I played the original version of Punch-Out! On the original arcade hardware at a retro arcade, and I thought this is awesome. Now, I had always heard that Super Punch-Out! Was a great game. I knew what people would say about it. I knew that they said that this was even better than Mike Tyson's Punch-Out!, that it was probably the best Punch-Out! Game ever created, that it's probably one of the best Super Nintendo games ever created. But I had never actually played the game. I recognized that I enjoyed other Punch-Out! Experiences that I had played. Literally every other Punch-Out! Experience I've had, whether you're talking about the arcade or the NES version of the title. I've had great fun with every Punch-Out! That I've tried, literally since I was a child. But why haven't I tried a game from the series that's widely considered to be the best of the bunch? I honestly don't know the answer to that question. But we are going to rectify that issue today. And as I sat down to begin playing Super Punch-Out! For today's episode, I was curious. Would I find yet another quality Punch-Out! Title, and one that might become my new personal favorite? Or would Super Punch-Out! Fail to impress me, despite its pedigree and my own personal love of the franchise? That is just one of the questions we're going to attempt to answer as we begin diving deeper into Super Punch-Out!. Super Punch-Out! Is an arcade-style boxing title developed and published by Nintendo for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System back in 1994. Before we can talk about Super Punch-Out! For the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, we need to go back even further into history to talk about the creation of the original Punch-Out! For the arcades, along with that title's lineage. And to do that, we need to begin by talking about Punch-Out's eventual creator, Genyo Takeda. Takeda might be a name that is more unfamiliar to many than some of Nintendo's more prominent designers and technologists, like Gunpei Yokoi and Shigeru Miyamoto, both of whom we've talked about several times before. But the fact is that Takeda's contributions to both Nintendo and the video game industry at large are just as significant as both Yokoi's and Miyamoto's. And over the course of his career, not only would he be responsible for countless enhancements to Nintendo's early arcade hardware, but he would also be the man behind the creation of the battery backup save system first used in the original Legend of Zelda, as well as the analog stick for the Nintendo 64 controller, and would even later become one of the lead designers for the Nintendo Wii console, acting as a vocal opponent to simply adding better graphics and horsepower to machines, suggesting rather that gameplay and design will trump sheer processing power any day of the week. Back in 1971, though, Takeda's career was still in front of him, as he had just graduated from Shizuoka Government University and was, as most college graduates typically are, in search of a job. As luck would have it, he noticed a job listing in a newspaper advertising roles with Nintendo, who at the time were just beginning to think about pivoting to more of an arcade and gaming focus, after spending the majority of their life as a playing card and toy manufacturer. Takeda, having gone to school to learn more about semiconductors and other electrical engineering concepts, thought that this might be a good fit for his skills. So he applied for the job, and after an interview with Nintendo's resident genius engineer, Gunpei Yokoi, received a job offer. Takeda didn't waste any time. He accepted that offer, and in 1971, would be hired into Nintendo by Yokoi as the newest member of its internal Research and Development 2 team, or R&D 2 as it was commonly called. Once hired into the company, Takeda would have the opportunity to work on Nintendo's very earliest arcade titles, including mechanical shooting range games like Laser Clay Shooting System and Wild Gunman in 1973 and 1974 respectively, and, perhaps most notably, would be responsible for designing the game that Nintendo calls their very first ever true arcade title, EVR Race. EVR Race was an electromechanical horse racing title, where up to 6 different players were allowed to bet on races in the hopes of choosing the horse who would ultimately win a given race. Unlike other electromechanical titles, though, EVR Race would include a monitor to display video played from an embedded videocassette, the first time Nintendo would branch out beyond a purely electromechanical device into something that included more digital components. Because Takeda was the designer behind EVR Race, which Nintendo considers their very first video game, Takeda himself has been named by many across the company, Shigeru Miyamoto included, as Nintendo's first game designer, despite the fact that his background is actually in electrical engineering. It turns out, Takeda was simply a multi-talented kind of guy. Anyway, after the release of EVR Race, Nintendo would continue to make a variety of games for arcades around the world, with Yokoi, Takeda, and eventually Miyamoto all working in various capacities on those early Nintendo games and the hardware that ran them. Not every endeavor was a full-fledged success, however, as one title in particular would create a situation that would have disastrous financial implications for the company, or at least it could have, if not for the efforts of a single individual. That game was Radarscope, a space fighter game that was effectively a more advanced take on Space Invaders, where players would be tasked with defending a space station from a never-ending onslaught of enemy aircraft. Radarscope was released in Japan in 1980, and based on early tests in Seattle, there was belief that the game could potentially become a big hit in the United States. So, the recently created Nintendo subsidiary, Nintendo of America, under the leadership of Nintendo President Hiroshi Yamauchi's son-in-law, Minoru Arakawa, decided to take a gamble. Arakawa spent the majority of Nintendo of America's budget on purchasing 3,000 Radarscope machines, with the hopes that they'd be able to take the United States by storm, turn a tidy profit, and set Nintendo of America up as a true force in the American gaming market. There was only one issue. Because of the shipping logistics that had been in place around this time, the arcade machines had to be transported from Japan to New York, and unplanned shipping delays made it so that the machines didn't reach America until 4 months after they were originally ordered. By that time, any degree of interest in the title had waned significantly. So out of those 3,000 radar scope cabinets, only 1,000 made their way into arcades across the United States. This left a significant number of unsold inventory just sitting in warehouses, which meant that the investment that Nintendo of America made in those machines was effectively a loss. So, Arakawa went to his father-in-law, Hiroshi Yamauchi, and asked if the company could somehow create a game that could be retrofitted into the unsold radar scope cabinets, effectively allowing Nintendo to sell a brand new game using the pre-existing hardware that would otherwise simply sit collecting dust. In an effort to avoid financial ruin, Yamauchi put out a company-wide call for ideas to convert Radar Scope into something that could potentially make the company some money. While many individuals would attempt to answer that call to action, it was one man, Shigeru Miyamoto, who would end up conceptualizing a winning idea that would, over a period of several months, morph into one of the most influential and successful video games of all time, the arcade classic Donkey Kong. After Miyamoto and others worked to create Donkey Kong conversion kits for the previously mentioned unsold radar scope cabinets, the game was released to the market and became an instant sensation, driving arcade owners everywhere to contact Nintendo for more cabinets to meet the demand of players. Over the course of the next year, more than 60,000 additional cabinets would be sold, and between cabinet sales and gamers spending hard-earned quarters on the machine, Donkey Kong would gross over $280 million by the end of 1982, which is the equivalent of nearly $1 billion in today's economy, an absolutely insane sales figure. Here's where the story gets even more interesting though, because typically when we think about mega successful arcade machines, we think about those machines in terms of their integrated cabinet, as opposed to the individual pieces that make up the machine. Or at least at a minimum, that's how I think about classic arcade machines. But as is fairly obvious, those cabinets are made up of a number of different components, such as the chips and circuitry that enable the game to run, display graphics and accept user inputs, and the monitor that allows users to actually see what's happening in a game. It stands to reason that for any company attempting to sell arcade cabinets, they'd have to invest in a ton of individual components that those cabinets required, which is why Nintendo made significant purchases to bulk buy arcade monitors. Since they weren't sure exactly how many machines they would need to manufacture, they only knew that the demand for their hardware was ever increasing. Well, even the most popular arcade games eventually reach a point of saturation, and Donkey Kong was no exception. After it took the gaming world by storm in 1982, sales for new Donkey Kong cabinets began to slow down, eventually leading to a different kind of issue for Nintendo. They now had a warehouse full of arcade monitors that were sitting unused, effectively creating a similar kind of situation as Nintendo of America's radar scope issue from a couple years prior. Nintendo wanted to figure out how to use all of that unsold inventory, and began brainstorming some ideas about other titles that could potentially use up some of that arcade monitor overstock. There was only one problem. Nintendo had a lot of excess arcade monitors, and by a lot, I mean a lot. So much so that they didn't believe a traditional single-monitor arcade game could even put a dent in their inventory, even if that arcade title became an industry-wide success. So they began to think about how they could potentially create a non-traditional arcade title, something that would use two monitors instead of just a single screen, which would by extension burn through the excess monitor inventory at double the rate as a traditional arcade cabinet. This sounded appealing, though in order to not simply use a bunch of monitors as a throwaway effort, there would have to be a strong game concept to go along with that innovative arcade design. Initial ideas revolved around creating a massive racing game, where two screens could be situated side by side to produce an immersive, engaging experience for players, and there was a lot of internal belief that this concept could potentially be a big seller. There was only one issue with that, and that issue centered squarely on consumer expectations for new arcade titles coming out in the early to mid-80s. One of the big innovations in arcade gaming around this time was the introduction of Laserdisc technology into a number of arcade cabinets, where titles like Dragon's Lair could recreate visuals that up to this point would have been unheard of given the limited hardware present in normal arcade machines. These graphically enhanced titles, while impressive to look at, were effectively an illusion, as most of them were simply streaming pre-drawn or recorded visuals from a Laserdisc as opposed to generating those visuals in real time. Laserdisc titles looked amazing, but it's not as though there was a dramatic leap in hardware power that accompanied their introduction. It was still the same base hardware, just a new way of delivering visual content. It was also a new way for arcade machines to break down, as Laserdisc players weren't designed for continuous and random scene switching. Sure, the underlying technology supported jumping from scene to scene without issue, and in normal use when watching a film, Laserdisc players performed perfectly fine. But when you subject a Laserdisc player to the stress of constant scene jumps, as you would experience in a popular arcade game, mechanical issues quickly arose, and repairs to those machines would, over time, become pretty costly. The issue, though, is that despite those mechanical failures and illusion of more powerful graphics hardware, Pandora's box had effectively been opened, and now arcade gamers had expectations for what they wanted new titles to look like. For companies attempting to keep up with those expectations, they had two choices. Either adopt Laserdisc technology themselves, or somehow increase the power of their hardware to create similar high-quality, large, detailed imagery, without the added maintenance expense of Laserdisc players. Nintendo recalled how expensive and time-consuming repairs on their prior mechanical arcade machines like EVR Racing were, and they weren't too keen to jump on the Laserdisc bandwagon. They wanted to avoid those kinds of mechanical issues, but they also wanted to meet the demands of the market, which meant they would need to figure out a different way of creating Laserdisc-like graphics, albeit without the use of a Laserdisc player. Interestingly, Nintendo hardware designers had recently come up with a new series of chips that could create some fairly advanced, for the time, visuals. And while Gunpei Yokoi, Genyo Takeda, and Shigeru Miyamoto were trying to figure out how to bring their dual-screen racing concept to life, they considered that these new chips might be able to provide the kind of advanced visuals that would allow the game to compete with the Laserdisc-driven graphics of competing titles. Everyone thought this idea had merit, but once they started digging into the technology, they encountered a fairly significant limitation. Nintendo's new chips were capable of advanced sprite scaling, and they were capable of automatically rotating sprites based on programmer instructions, both of which were dramatic improvements over the traditional way arcade games were designed, all of which required manual by-hand manipulation of pixels and graphics. The thing is, while the chip could scale and rotate graphics, they couldn't scale and rotate graphics at the same time. This, as you might imagine, restricted the use of those chips to only a single graphical operation, and this kind of limitation simply wouldn't work for the racing title that the team was trying to bring to life. They needed both rotation and scaling in order to make the title they wanted to make, and even beyond that, they wanted to scale multiple images at the same time, which given current hardware of the time, just wasn't possible. So the team went back to the drawing board, and here, Takeda had an idea. What if they used those new chips to scale the image of a person as opposed to a bunch of vehicles? By keeping the focus on a singular character, they could avoid rotating any sprites, which allowed them to use the new graphics chipset to focus solely on scaling, which would fit perfectly within the constraints of the hardware. The rest of the team agreed that this idea made sense. Now, they just had to figure out what kind of game to create with that style of character scaling in place. It's not clear exactly who came up with the idea of creating a boxing game out of this concept, but that is ultimately what happened, which is what resulted in the creation of the first Punch-Out arcade machine in 1984. Now, the observant amongst you might be curious about why two screens would be needed for a boxing title, because the fact is, there really is no need to use two screens for a single-player boxing game. Sure, if the game were multiplayer, you could have potentially used a single monitor per player, but Punch-Out was not intended to be multiplayer. It was designed as a single-player experience. For a period of time, using two screens for Punch-Out seemed like an idea that simply didn't make sense. Takeda, however, would end up having another idea that would end up working perfectly. Thinking about a typical real-world boxing match, you have both the one-on-one match, which is obviously the focus, and oftentimes you have the bright lights, video screens, and expansive stadium-style backdrop that big-time boxing matches often take place in. Takeda considered that by stacking the two screens vertically, he could potentially use the bottom screen in a traditional arcade cabinet orientation, using it for the main boxing match that players would be participating in. The second, higher stacked screen could then be used to recreate the big stadium kind of feel as a world-class boxing match, including high-quality character portraits and stats that apply to each of the fighters. The team was not entirely convinced that this would work, but after playing around with an initial prototype, they realized that this dual-screen configuration was pretty darn fun, and it didn't take long before everyone agreed that this concept, and by extension Punch-Out, would be the solution to their excess monitor stock inventory issues. The team finalized the artwork, much of which was created by Miyamoto, added in some music in what would be legendary composer Koji Kondo's first assignment as a new Nintendo employee, and created a simple control scheme utilizing jabs, hooks, and uppercuts that would hopefully attract players to test their skills against the 6 computer-controlled combatants that stood in between players and the in-game World Boxing Championship. Punch-Out would be released to arcades in early 1984, and to say it was a big deal would be an understatement. Over the course of the year, Punch-Out would end up dominating arcades around the world, becoming one of the top-selling arcade titles of the year, and in the United States, taking the crown as the highest-grossing arcade game of 1984. Because of the knockout success of Punch-Out, a sequel would be greenlit before the year even ended, and just 6 months after the original game's release, Super Punch-Out would make its way to arcades in late 1984. This title, more so than the original game, would be helmed almost exclusively by Takeda, as Miyamoto, who had contributed a ton of character artwork to Punch-Out, was rapidly becoming more involved with Famicom game development, and therefore didn't have the time to dedicate as much effort to Super Punch-Out's development. Regardless, Super Punch-Out, which would effectively be designed identically to Punch-Out other than being harder and featuring different characters who utilized some very non-boxing kinds of attacks, would release to critical acclaim, and would end up being awarded the title of Best Game of the Show at the October 1984 Amusement and Music Operators Association, or AMOA, industry event. Following Punch-Out and Super Punch-Out's success, the majority of the design team would go off to work on other endeavors, with Takeda focusing more on hardware, and Miyamoto, like we mentioned, turning his attention to creating revolutionary Famicom games and franchises that would make Nintendo a household name in just a couple of years. As the Famicom continued to gain popularity, and once the Nintendo Entertainment System was released in America to staggering popularity, the creative team at Nintendo began thinking about what types of games to create that could potentially appeal to a broad audience. And here, there was recognition that Punch-Out might be a perfect fit for Nintendo's 8-bit console ecosystem. Wanting to maintain continuity between the original game's development and the potential 8-bit version, Genyo Takeda was assigned to be the director of the title, and with that, work began on creating a version of Punch-Out that would, hopefully, recreate the arcade action of the original, albeit in the comfort of players' homes around the world. Interestingly, because of the difference in technical capabilities between arcade machines and the Nintendo Famicom, the game itself would need to change fairly dramatically. For one, each character model needed to be redefined, as the huge sprites used in the arcade machine required several workarounds to be implemented within the limitations of 8-bit hardware. And secondly, there was the issue of how to create the character that players would control as they attempted to become the boxing champion of the world. I didn't mention it before, but in the arcade version of Punch-Out, the player character is defined as a green wireframe model, the thought being that you could effectively see through your character to see your opponent and react to their moves. When the time came to implement those graphics and transparency effects for the home market, it was quickly realized that the Nintendo Famicom just wasn't powerful enough to recreate the same graphical tricks as the arcade version. So Takeda and the team did the next best thing. They decided to shrink your persona, making a much smaller character who would take up less screen real estate and therefore would provide a larger view of your opponent's moves. Because of the diminutive stature of this new character, it only made sense that his name should mirror his size. And with that design decision finalized, the boxer known as Little Mac was born. Various other changes would be made to the home port of the title, with the inclusion of additional fighters and patterns to learn in order to prolong the length of the gameplay experience, as well as a reduction to the overall graphical fidelity to better align with the Nintendo Famicom's hardware capabilities. And after making those modifications, Punch-Out's development would be complete, though interestingly, it was not yet slated for a broad public release, despite being 100% ready to ship. The reason for that delay is that Nintendo was in the midst of sponsoring a tournament in their latest golf title, Famicom Golf US Course, and the company thought that it would be worthwhile to make their brand new title, Punch-Out, be an award for individuals attaining high scores during that tournament. To commemorate that accomplishment, 10,000 gold cartridge copies of Punch-Out would be produced, with half given to high scorers in the tournament, while the other half would be distributed via a lottery amongst a broader population of Japanese gamers. While that tournament was going on in Japan, a different kind of competition was occurring in the United States, that being the coronation of a young 21-year-old boxer as one of the most fierce, dynamic, powerful fighters the sport of boxing had ever seen. That boxer, of course, was Mike Tyson. Minoru Arakawa, the original founder of Nintendo of America, had an opportunity to attend a boxing match featuring Mike Tyson, and was immediately impressed by the fighter's raw power and skill. Arakawa considered that this might be an excellent opportunity to garner some additional attention on the forthcoming Punch-Out release in North America, as Mike Tyson was pretty much one of the most recognizable and bankable boxing stars in the world at this point, and in the United States in particular, anything involving Tyson would immediately draw blockbuster viewership. So, Arakawa approached Tyson with an opportunity, asking if he would be interested in licensing his likeness as a character for Nintendo's forthcoming boxing title, becoming the game's final boss fight. In return, Nintendo would pay Tyson $50,000 for a 3-year exclusivity deal to use his likeness in the game. For a fighter who had not yet won a boxing championship, $50,000 in mid-80s money for nothing other than appearing in a video game sounded like a great deal. So Tyson agreed with the proposal, and with that agreement, Punch-Out would be marketed in the United States as Mike Tyson's Punch-Out, with a re-release under the Mike Tyson licensing deal following in Japan. Mike Tyson's Punch-Out would officially release on the market in late 1987, which, conveniently for Nintendo, was after Mike Tyson ended up winning his first boxing title, which, as you might expect, immediately increased the visibility and demand for the game. Tyson was the hottest fighter in the world, and because of the deal Arakawa had struck a year earlier, Nintendo was now the owner of the official boxing title, featuring the hottest fighter in the world. This, as you may have guessed, increased sales of the title well beyond initial expectations, as Mike Tyson's Punch-Out would end up selling over 2 million copies in just a single year following its release, which made it just the second NES game to reach that number of sales in that time period, with the only other game reaching those sales heights being the original Legend of Zelda. Definitely good company for the newly released game to be in. Upon its release, Mike Tyson's Punch-Out would receive universal acclaim, with critics and players alike praising the game's graphics, controls, and addicting gameplay loop. And it wouldn't take long before Mike Tyson's Punch-Out would make its way to a number of Best Games of the Year lists, followed by being named one of the best NES games of all time, and finally, achieving a position of prominence as one of the best games ever created, period. Countless gamers would end up playing the title in either its original incarnation or, after Tyson's 3-year licensing deal ended, the re-released 1990 version that replaced Mike Tyson with Mr. Dream, a fictional character with different visuals but the same exact moveset as Iron Mike. Interestingly, if we were talking about my personal history with the Punch-Out series, this is exactly where we would end, because other than knowing of the game's existence in the arcades, the only Punch-Out title I had personally played up until around a year ago was Mike Tyson's Punch-Out on the NES, and honestly, I was content. I didn't think I needed more Punch-Out in my life, because the NES release was such a high-quality and replayable game. Sure, Mike Tyson himself could be ridiculously difficult, but it didn't even matter because the rest of the game was much more approachable, and even in the Tyson fight itself, I never felt like I didn't have control over my actions, or ultimately my fate. I just knew Tyson was going to beat me 99 times out of 100, and I was okay with that outcome. Then, around a year ago, I had an opportunity to visit a retro arcade, and in that arcade was the original Punch-Out cabinet, and I thought to myself, oh yeah, I need to play this one. So I did, and I had a great time. Admittedly, the game was a bit different than what I was used to. There was a punch meter on the bottom of the screen, which when filled up would indicate when you could unleash a devastating uppercut. Opponents, who I assumed would act identically to their NES counterparts, were similar, but just different enough to make the experience feel unique. The graphics and design of each character was much more detailed, as you might expect, given the capabilities of arcade hardware in comparison to home consoles, and perhaps most surprisingly to me at the time, the game featured a limited set of continues, which was expected on the NES, but really shocked me to see in an arcade machine. I mean, sure, there have been arcade titles that would limit the number of continues you might have, even if you have a pocket full of quarters, but those were few and far between. I expected to be able to load that machine up with a ton of credits and play the darn thing until I beat it, only that was very much not in the cards, and I didn't want to deprive others from experiencing the very first Punch-Out title in its original form. So I played through a couple rounds, made it to the third or fourth fighter, and then called it a day, happy that I had played a piece of video game history, but also curious about what other Punch-Out goodness I might have been missing out on given my focus on the NES version of the title. Which brings us to a few months ago, which is when I decided on a whim that I needed more Punch-Out in my life, and as I was deliberating on which game to play, I recalled that Super Punch-Out was available on the Nintendo Switch online service. So I sat down, fired up my Switch, and began to play Super Punch-Out, a title that you, like I once did, might think is a sequel to the NES version of the game, but actually can trace its lineage back to the arcades, similar to the NES port of the original Punch-Out title. We talked briefly about the arcade version of Super Punch-Out earlier, which was released less than a year following the original Punch-Out's debut, and was, at least compared to the arcade version of Punch-Out, effectively more of the same, other than including a new stable of characters with new patterns to react to, some of which featured non-traditional movesets, at least in terms of the standard boxing strategy of only using your fists to bludgeon your opponents. When the NES version of Punch-Out was created, it was intended to be less of a port of the arcade game and more of a reimagining given the limitations of the 8-bit NES, and as such it would actually feature characters from both Punch-Out and Super Punch-Out, while adding some original characters to the mix to give players a more engaging, deeper, and longer experience than what they might have had in arcades at the time. While the NES version of Punch-Out did inherit the general design of the arcade iteration of the title, it was in fact pretty darn different, especially if you were to look at a side-by-side comparison of the games. I'm not saying the NES Punch-Out looked bad, I'm just saying the arcade version of the title looks even better. And there were also some gameplay differences to take into account, which when looked at holistically, meant that the NES version of the game was truly its own release. Not really a port, but certainly a derivative of the arcade version of the game. I mention all of this because, when work on Super Punch-Out on the Super Nintendo Entertainment System began in the early 90s, the thought amongst the team was very similar to how they thought about the NES version of Punch-Out. They knew they wanted to create another Punch-Out for the home, but they didn't want to simply port the arcade version to the Super NES and call it a day. Instead, they wanted to reimagine Punch-Out yet again, only this time they could leverage the 16-bit power of then-modern consoles to hopefully create a Punch-Out experience even better than the original, regardless of which original you may be talking about. The biggest change to Super Punch-Out in comparison to the NES version of the title was arguably with the visuals. The Super Nintendo was a much more capable system than the NES, and that extra graphics and processing power would enable the team behind Super Punch-Out to adopt graphics that much more closely resembled the arcade versions of both Punch-Out and Super Punch-Out, with larger-than-life opponents and more detailed animations than what the NES would be capable of, and with an overall level of graphical fidelity and detail that exceeded the arcade originals. The The Super NES version of the game would also borrow the more complex controls of the arcade version of the title, with a punch meter dictating when and how often you could unleash a knockout blow, in comparison to the star-based uppercut system of the NES version of the game, and would also allow you the ability to duck, in addition to the traditional side-to-side avoidance and blocking that would be prevalent in every Punch-Out title, opening up even more gameplay possibilities for gamers to explore. The Super NES iteration of the game would also improve upon the overall roster of opponents available to fight, as the game would be split up into 4 different divisions, each of which would feature 4 boxers, for a total of 16 different characters to face. When compared to the arcade version of Punch-Out, which featured 6 combatants, Super Punch-Out in the arcades, which featured 5 opponents, and the NES version of Punch-Out, which had 11 unique fighters spread across its multiple divisions, the Super NES version of Super Punch-Out was the clear winner. And, as was a staple of the Punch-Out series, each fighter would be truly unique, with a variety of patterns to memorize, combos to neutralize, and openings to exploit, all of which the team hoped would make Super Punch-Out on the Super NES the definitive version of Punch-Out, whether you were talking about the home console space or the arcade scene. Similar to Punch-Out on the NES, the Super NES version of Super Punch-Out shared the same arcade lineage of its predecessor, but was designed to be more than a simple port of the arcade experience. Only this time, the design considerations made for the game would be focused on how to enhance the experience rather than how to change the experience to meet the restrictions of the 8-bit NES console's capabilities. Unfortunately, not all of those proposed enhancements would make it into the final game. Or at least, they wouldn't all be easily accessible in the released version of the title. Because, unlike any Punch-Out title that had come before it, Super Punch-Out would include a 2-player mode. Now, I know what you might be thinking. What the heck are you talking about? Super Punch-Out didn't have a 2-player mode. To which I would reply, well, sort of. While it's true the final released version of the game did not feature a 2-player mode, there was a 2-player mode built into the game, or at least the ability to play a one-on-one fight with one person controlling Little Mac, and the other controlling any of the 16 other characters featured in the game. While it's not clear whether this was originally intended to be a fully featured add-on that didn't make the cut for the final release, or a simple way for the development team to debug the various boxers included in the game, I'm not sure. What I am sure of, though, is that this particular secret would remain hidden for 28 years after the game's eventual release, which is insane to me. Given the way almost every popular and even less popular games have been analyzed and taken apart just to see how they work, I am shocked that it took this long to discover this hidden feature in Super Punch-Out. While I'm sure there were reasons why the game's development team chose to hide rather than remove this non-standard feature, the simple fact is that its inclusion has become an interesting piece of trivia in the development of the game, and one that interested players can actually try out today, rather than being left only to imagine what might have been. Putting that cut feature and eventual well-hidden secret aside, the team had high hopes that Super Punch-Out on the SNES would be another strong addition to what was now a true gaming franchise. The only question was, would gamers and critics agree that all of that effort was worth it? The answer to that question would come in late 1994, as Super Punch-Out would hit store shelves and be available for gamers, at least in North America, to purchase and hopefully enjoy. Luckily for everyone, upon its release, Super Punch-Out would be critically acclaimed and commercially successful, with a number of critics giving the game absolutely glowing reviews, with many praising the game's difficulty curve, gameplay, visuals, and arcade-styled boxing action, while others declared the title to be the best version of Punch-Out yet. There were occasional detractors, many of whom would complain that the addition of non-boxing-centric moves made the game feel less like a pure boxing title, which admittedly is true. But by and large, nearly everyone who played the game walked away impressed with what Nintendo had been able to accomplish. This was the deepest, most accessible, best-looking, and most diverse the Punch-Out series had ever been. And though the game wouldn't be considered quite as brutally difficult as the NES release of Punch-Out several years prior, it would still be considered by many to be a pretty tough game, albeit with a smoother difficulty curve than its predecessor. It would also, like its predecessor, be widely considered to be one of the best games of all time, with countless publications placing Super Punch-Out near the top of their respective best Super NES games ever created lists, and many individuals, including modern reviewers, continuing to praise the game as an all-time classic, even today. Beyond Super Punch-Out's original Super NES release, Punch-Out as a series would continue to feature releases and re-releases throughout the years, with a modernized reboot of Punch-Out for the Nintendo Wii and Wii U releasing in 2009, and various versions of the NES, Super NES, and arcade titles being re-released on virtual storefronts in more modern times, including on the Nintendo Switch, where players young and old can once again attempt to win a championship, using only their fists and their wits to overcome their opponents. The primary individuals who worked on the Punch-Out series over the years, including Super Punch-Out, would themselves go on to have quite a career in the video game industry, with both Miyamoto and Takeda achieving executive positions in Nintendo, with Miyamoto becoming the chief creative fellow for the entire company, and Takeda achieving a technical fellowship within Nintendo, which really reflected his contributions to the video game industry and Nintendo hardware in particular. He would further be recognized at the 21st Annual DICE, or DICE Awards in 2018, as a Lifetime Achievement Award recipient, which is the video game equivalent of an Academy Awards Lifetime Achievement recognition. It is, to put it mildly, a significant recognition of a career in which Takeda spent relentlessly innovating and pushing the boundaries of what others thought might be possible. Was that innovation and creativity demonstrated with the Super NES version of Super Punch-Out? Well, that's a good question, and it is just one of the areas we're going to look at as we begin diving even deeper into Super Punch-Out. We are now going to shift to start talking about what it feels like to play Super Punch-Out today versus when it was released over 30 years ago. The best way to describe Super Punch-Out is that it is, like its predecessor, an arcade boxing experience. When you sit down to begin playing Super Punch-Out, you're going to quickly realize that this is not intended to be a realistic boxing simulation, though a lot of the aspects of the game do in fact feel like you're taking part in a real boxing match, and we're going to talk about all of that as we continue our discussion. The game itself is designed around the concept of different championship circuits, and when you first start playing the game, there are 3 circuits to work your way through, plus a hidden 4th circuit, assuming you become the champion of the first 3 available circuits. That 4th circuit, by the way, is much more challenging than the prior circuits. We're going to talk about difficulty in the game in a little bit. Each of those circuits, though, do equate roughly to overall difficulty levels. The very first circuit that you'll experience is pretty darn simple, and each subsequent circuit will become more challenging as you play the game. Each individual circuits feature 4 different boxers, each of which are unique and offer up different patterns to recognize and deal with, whether that means offensively or defensively. Your ability to respond to your opponent's moves, whether offensively or defensively, will be driven by your own ability to memorize the patterns of your opponents, as well as using the controls at your disposal. And luckily, those controls are designed similarly to the original Punch-Out, albeit with some additional refinement and complexity. To start our discussions on the game's controls, let's focus on the D-pad, which can be used to dodge left or right, similar to the original Punch-Out, and can also be used to influence which punches you attempt to land on your opponents. Punches can be initiated by using either your left or right fists, which corresponds to the Y and B buttons on your controller respectively, and playing the game, you can choose to either attack the body or the head of your opponents. To initiate a body punch, you would press either the Y or the B button without any directional pad input, whereas if you want to try to punch the head, you need to press up and a punch button at the same time, which will initiate a head attack. You can also initiate blocks that cover both your head and your body depending on what button combinations you press. To do a body block, you literally just stand still and you don't press any buttons or D-pad directions. You just stand there, wait for the punch to almost try to hit you, and luckily, if it's a body attack, you will block that move. If you want to initiate a head block though, you have to press up on your D-pad with no other inputs. New to Super Punch-Out in comparison to the NES version is the ability to duck attacks, which you can do by pressing down on your D-pad. Also new is the knockout punch, which you can execute with your A button when your punch meter is full. This punch meter is a brand new addition to the game, at least from a home console perspective, because in the original version of Punch-Out for the NES, the way that you would initiate stronger attacks was based on a star system, where if you had certain hits or you landed certain hits on your opponents, you would gain stars, and then if you pressed the start button on your controller, you could initiate an uppercut kind of attack, assuming that you had stars available to use. In Super Punch-Out, the whole concept of this star system has been thrown out, and instead you now have a punch meter. The punch meter will start to fill as you land different moves, different punches on your opponent, as long as you don't take damage. If you get hit by your opponent, the punch meter will start to decrease, whereas if you hit your opponent, the punch meter will start to increase. And if you can max out your punch meter, you will be able to execute a bunch of different kinds of punches. If you press the A button by itself, you'll initiate a hook to the body, whereas if you press A plus up, you're going to try to do an uppercut. You can also double tap the A button plus up to do rapid uppercuts, and if you double tap the A button by itself, you'll try to do rapid hooks to the body. The controls that we just talked about will form the foundation of your entire playthrough, and will need to be used in various combinations to defeat each of the 16 opponents you'll eventually be facing. And actually, now is probably a good time to talk about the opponents, the roster of characters that you'll be facing as you play Super Punch-Out. I've got to say, this was an incredibly diverse set of characters. Pretty much everyone in the game has their own unique moves and combos to learn. There are a couple of characters that have a little bit of repetition between the moves that they use. Most prominently, twin brothers who you'll face at the very end of the special circuit, as well as a couple of oversized boxers that, while not sharing the exact same moveset, do have similar moves to learn and eventually exploit. This, though, is not that big of a deal, and the fact is that Super Punch-Out's cast of characters have a huge variety across all of their moves and patterns that you're going to try to memorize. Much more so than in the original version of Punch-Out for the NES, where as you made your way through the various circuits in that game, you might see the same exact fighter appear in multiple circuits. Now granted, those fighters would potentially have different moves or additional moves to deal with at the later circuits because they became more powerful or they became more experienced and therefore added new moves to their overall repertoire. But in Super Punch-Out, you have no actual fighter repetition. You do have a little bit of move repetition, but the fact is that moves are used in such a variety of way that it never feels like anything was a copy-paste kind of thing, which is really awesome. Even more awesome, though, is that learning and exploiting each boxer's patterns is so much deeper than prior versions of Punch-Out. So much so that this feels almost like a full-fledged puzzle game. Now, it's not truly a puzzle game. You're not going to be playing Super Punch-Out to try to get a puzzle kind of experience. But the fact is, in order to beat each of the opponents that you'll eventually face, you do need to figure out the patterns of their moves. And sometimes those patterns will require you to go on the offensive. You want to hit them before they can hit you. Other times, you may have to figure out when to block an attack or dodge an attack. And sometimes patterns require combinations of all of the above, meaning there might be a certain combination where the first punch in an opponent's moveset is something you need to dodge. And then the second punch you can't dodge, but you can block. And maybe the third punch is something you can't block or dodge, but you can duck. You need to figure out all of the different permutations of these patterns in order to allow you to progress through the game. And it is an awesome feeling to learn all of these different patterns and to eventually pull off a perfect fight against your opponents. You will not pull off a perfect fight on many of your opponents the first time through the game. And the fact is that that is actually an incredible part of the overall experience, because before you have every pattern memorized and every counter move understood, which once you do, the game becomes much simpler to deal with. But before you have that memorization indoctrinated in your brain, the game feels so much like a real back and forth boxing match. In fact, it feels more like a real back and forth boxing match than almost any boxing title that I have played, past or present. There are, though, some liberal applications of the rules of boxing, because, like I mentioned earlier, this is an arcade boxing experience. This is not a boxing simulation. In Super Punch-Out, you only have one round for every single fight that you face, and you can either win by knockout or technical knockout or TKO. A TKO happens when you knock down your opponent 3 times in a single round. So you can either win a given match by knocking your opponent out directly, which means they can't answer a 10 count and stand up to their feet, or you can knock them down 3 times in that single round. Either way, you will earn the victory. Now you might be wondering, what about decisions? What about if the fight goes to the cards, the judges' scorecards? Well, this game has never heard of that concept, because if you don't definitively beat your opponent, you lose your match. This creates a situation where you need to balance defense with offensive opportunities, because you could legitimately be in a fight, take no damage, and knock your opponent down twice in that single fight, and still lose the match. You could dominate your opponent for the entire fight and still lose the match if you don't knock them out or knock them down 3 times. This time limit you might think is restrictive, but it actually makes the game incredibly exciting and creates the kind of tug-of-war back-and-forth action that you typically only see in Rocky movies. And I'm not exaggerating. I had so much fun simply fighting different opponents in this game, especially before I became proficient enough at each opponent to regularly beat them. And occasionally, I would even let out an audible cheer when I'd get a come-from-behind victory against a particularly challenging foe. There were a number of times when my opponent would knock me down, and then I would get back up and knock him down, and then he'd knock me down again, and then I would knock him down again, and then the final knockout blow would come with literal seconds left on the clock. This was incredibly exciting to experience, and even though many of the opponents you'll face will use non-boxing moves like kicks or even sometimes use weapons, the way the action plays out in the game is pure boxing-fueled goodness. Sometimes, though, as you might expect, a match might not end in your favor. Luckily, there is a continue system built into the game for rematches, and you can earn additional continues by hitting various point thresholds in your overall score, with your match performance dictating how many points you get in a given fight. If you do lose every continue, though, it's game over, though each circuit's progress is saved independently, meaning if you beat the minor circuit, you don't need to beat it again. The game will maintain the fact that you beat it, and you can simply focus on the circuits that you haven't yet beaten, which is an improvement over the original NES version of Punch-Out, where you had to play the entire game straight. Now, granted, you had a password system, so it wasn't truly like you had to play the entire game straight, but I do appreciate and prefer a save game-based system as opposed to a password-based system like we had in prior NES titles. Anyway, assuming you do eventually beat the 3 initially available circuits, you'll unlock a 4th secret circuit, which features the most challenging boxers in the entire game. To put it into perspective, if you've played Punch-Out on the NES for any length of time, I would wager that you'll be able to beat the first 3 circuits without too much difficulty. There's definitely challenge there, but it's not bad at all, so much so that a couple of the circuits you'll likely beat your first time through, simply based on using muscle memory that you likely acquired playing the original Punch-Out. That 4th circuit, though, is a different beast entirely, and more so than any other circuit before it, really does make each fight a puzzle to solve. This one took me a while to complete, mostly because your opponent patterns become more complex, and the window for reacting to those patterns becomes shorter, the combination of which makes the 4th circuit a pretty darn challenging experience. Even with the secret circuit, though, Super Punch-Out never gets as challenging as the NES version of the game, and from my perspective, that's actually a good thing. Super Punch-Out is almost perfectly balanced, and the difficulty curve here feels amazing to experience. While I would argue that Punch-Out on the NES, and in particular Mike Tyson's Punch-Out, is an iconic 8-bit experience that everyone needs to play, I would also argue that Super Punch-Out on the Super Nintendo is actually a dramatically better experience than that original title, in nearly every conceivable way. Anyway, beyond the standard circuit mode, there's also a time attack mode to hone your skills and sharpen your knowledge of each opponent, as well as an extensive record-keeping system that allows you to see how well you've performed over the course of your career, which was a relatively minor inclusion in the grand scheme of things, but was still something I greatly appreciated. And honestly, I ended up appreciating nearly every aspect of the game, because Super Punch-Out, like I mentioned, is a dramatically better game than its predecessor, and has quickly jumped up my personal list of best Super NES and best boxing games of all time. We're going to talk more about why I ended up loving Super Punch-Out in just a little bit. First though, as we always do, we need to take a look at the back of the box, because as you all know, I love looking at the back of the box for these games. I love learning how different companies marketed their titles, especially in the era of gaming that we typically look at. Back then, we didn't have YouTube with gameplay videos. We didn't have a pervasive internet. Back then, when we made a buying decision, it was often based off of word of mouth from family and friends, reviews we may have read in magazines, and what the box actually looked like sitting on the store shelf. Did the front of the box make the game look cool? If so, we'd pick it up. Did the back of the box make the game sound cool? If so, we might purchase it. If not, back on the shelf it would go. So, for Super Punch-Out for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, the back of the box says Super Punch-Out. The mega-selling sports series is a knockout on Super NES. Slug your way through the grueling and sweat-pounding matches of the minor, major, and world circuits. Dodge bone-bruising punches and dance to the top of the Supreme Special Circuit. Face off against old favorites including Bear Hugger, Piston Hurricane, Bald Bull, Mr. Sandman, and Super Macho Man, plus a cast of new and weird challengers. With a right hook, body blow, and precise quick jabs, the referee announces knockout. Your opponent lies face down as you win the title of Nintendo Video Boxing Association Champion. And then some bullets. The famous arcade classic features innovative updates for the Super NES. Challenge 16 opponents in the minor, major, world, and special circuits. Up to 8 players can store their fastest knockout times, better their score, or continue to the top. Battery-backed memory tracks statistics. Spar against favorite foes from the arcade and NES versions, as well as new and entertaining opponents. And then there are some screenshots on the back of the box that shows 4 different fighters and your fights against those fighters. And I've got to say, yes, this box definitely sells me on the overall experience. I will admit, I am not entirely sure why I didn't play Super Punch-Out when I was younger. This is the kind of game that absolutely would appeal to me. I loved the original Mike Tyson's Punch-Out on the NES. I didn't have any experience with the arcade version of the title back when I was younger, though that was something I rectified just within the last year. But honestly, I don't know why I never played Super Punch-Out. The box sells me today. It would have sold me back then. I have no clue. I honestly don't know why I avoided this game for so long. But I am very glad that I have fixed that issue because I gotta tell you, Super Punch-Out is awesome. And this box perfectly captures what you're going to get when you play Super Punch-Out. Anyway, we're going to move past the box to start talking about the more specific aspects of the game, and we're going to start by talking about the graphics. The graphics in Super Punch-Out are absolutely outstanding. There are huge character sprites. You have incredibly detailed visuals, smooth and varied animations. Everything looked so good. This is one seriously good-looking Super Nintendo title, and I would put its graphics above the arcade versions of either Punch-Out or Super Punch-Out. I actually did. I took a side-by-side comparison of the two because I was curious. As I was playing the Super Nintendo version, I thought to myself, this looks and feels amazing. So I was curious if the graphics here actually exceeded the arcade originals because the arcade games were made back in 1984. So I figured, hey, a decade has got to be worth something, right? And it turns out, yes, Yes, it is, because the Super NES version of Super Punch-Out is, from my perspective, the best-looking version of Punch-Out released up to that point in history. It looks so good. It plays so well, the smoothness of the animations and the moves, and that smoothness is really important, by the way, because your ability to actually succeed at this game is going to be based on your ability to react to your opponent's moves. If the graphics didn't appropriately reflect what those moves were, and the animations were janky or gave you a situation where you couldn't tell what your opponents were doing, the game would be unplayable. Luckily, this is not the case because Super Punch-Out looks really good. Moving on to the sound and music, there's great music here all around and all throughout the game, including the pre-fight music for each boxer, though I do have to admit that the music here is not quite as iconic, at least from my perspective, as the NES version of Punch-Out. And those themes, by the way, on the NES version, there's some themes in there that I can still recite from memory today. I don't know if that's because I've literally played that game for well over 30 years or not, but other than a couple of pre-fight themes that I thought were interesting, the music in Super Punch-Out feels just a smidge less memorable than what was featured in Punch-Out. Sound effects, though, are perfect and truly enhance the action on the screen as you pummel your opponents into oblivion, or you yourself receive a similar pummeling. In all instances, I loved the sound effects in the game. New to Super Punch-Out, at least in comparison to the NES version of the game, is the voice work, all of which was performed by longtime Mario voice actor Charles Martinet. I appreciated the inclusion of voices in the game, though I do have to say, there wasn't a ton here to actually listen to, and I would argue that the voices that played throughout the game didn't really sound all that different from one another, which was a bit of a disappointment. Still, it's cool that they're there, even if only to distinguish Super Punch-Out more from its predecessor. Overall, I have no real complaints about the audio in the game. The auditory environment was perfectly fine for this style of title. Moving on to the narrative and story, this is a boxing game, so there's really no story here other than what you make of it. And I've mentioned before that oftentimes when I play a game without a story, I do develop my own internal story about what's happening in the game. I didn't do that all that much here simply because the gameplay was so engaging that I didn't need to make something up in my head. I was just a boxer trying to win some championships, and honestly, that was good enough for me. Moving on to the gameplay and controls, we already talked about the general controls for the game as well as the overall gameplay, so I'm not going to rehash all of that here. What I will say though, and what I want everyone to take away from this discussion, is simply how good it feels to play Super Punch-Out. There wasn't a single moment playing the game that I felt like the controls betrayed me, or that the gameplay wasn't super tight and engaging. This is one of those experiences where pictures and watching gameplay videos will never do it justice. You have to experience Super Punch-Out to really know what all the fuss is about, and I would argue that even individuals who disliked the NES version of Punch-Out will likely find something to like with Super Punch-Out. It is an impeccably designed arcade boxing experience, and one that I cannot believe I missed back when it originally came out. Do not make the same mistake I did. If you've never played the game before, fire it up and begin playing it right now. I promise you, it'll be worth it. So, what is our verdict on Super Punch-Out? Well, I gotta say, Super Punch-Out surprised me. Not because I thought it was going to be a bad game. No, I was pretty darn sure Super Punch-Out was going to be a Pantheon contender before I sat down to play it. What truly surprised me, though, was just how good it was. And coming from the perspective of someone who thought Mike Tyson's Punch-Out on the NES was arcade boxing nirvana, I was truly shocked at how much better Super Punch-Out was than that iconic release, in pretty much every way imaginable. Because of how good Super Punch-Out is, and because of how much I loved every second of my time with the game, it's probably not a surprise that Super Punch-Out has just become the newest member of our Pantheon of Classic Gaming. It is an all-time classic, and a game that has quickly been added to my short list of best Super NES games of all time. If you haven't tried this one before, or like me, you thought it couldn't get better than Mike Tyson's Punch-Out, consider this your invitation to be pleasantly surprised. Super Punch-Out is a game with almost no flaws, and for what it tries to do, which is create an arcade-centric boxing experience, there's pretty much no equal. Do not sleep on this one. Super Punch-Out is a phenomenal experience and is a game that I have no reservations in recommending to literally everyone, and is therefore obviously deserving of its spot in our pantheon of classic gaming. It is now time to talk about this week's set of gaming challenges, and they are all, of course, focused on Super Punch-Out. Your first challenge, worth a single coin, is to knock out Bald Bull. Bald Bull has been in pretty much every Punch-Out title, for the most part. If you can knock him out, you will earn 1 coin. Your second challenge is to become the Major Circuit Champion. There are 4 circuits in the game. The Major Circuit is the second circuit. If you can become the champion of the Major Circuit, you will earn 2 coins. And finally, your third challenge is to unlock the Special Circuit. The Special Circuit can be unlocked by beating the other 3 circuits. If you can unlock the Special Circuit, you don't have to beat it, but if you can unlock it, you will earn 3 coins. As always, post proof of your accomplishments out on the CGT Gaming Challenges channel over on Discord. Good luck! You're going to need it. That was our episode on Super Punch-Out. I hope you all enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed creating it. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general, I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It's patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday is where it's at. Before we sign off for the week, I do want to mention that our next episode is going to be our second ever Nostalgia Trip episode, where I will talk about going to the arcades in the 80s and 90s. Along the way, I'm going to shout out a bunch of my personal favorite arcade games of all time. Will your favorite be on the list? Well, you're going to have to listen in to find out. And if you feel like it, send me a note about what your personal favorite arcade experiences were from back around that time and get your comments featured on the show. At the same time, I recognize you're likely listening to this podcast on any number of podcast services. And if you would feel so inclined, it would be great if you could leave me a review. This is not about trying to bolster star counts. This is not about trying to harvest a ton of 5-star ratings, though if that happens, awesome, it means we're doing something right. No, what it's really all about is trying to deliver the best possible podcast I can. The only way to do that is to get feedback from all of you, the listener community, to make sure I'm hitting the mark and delivering the content you all want to listen to. We get new listeners every single day, which is simply amazing. I want to continue to grow this community and continue to make the best possible podcast I can. We'll be back in around a week with our next episode focused on what it felt like to go to the arcades in the 80s and 90s. Until then, remember, sometimes the games of the past are just as good, if not better, than the games of today. Goodbye, everyone.